What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We're going to take a look at the best and worst case scenario for the Clemson Tigers. So if everything goes their way, we're going to tell you what the result will be at the end of the year and what it's going to take for them to get there. And then on the flip side, we're going to take a look at the worst case scenario for Clemson. What if everything goes wrong? What will the season look like for the Clemson Tigers in 2021? The Clemson football program has come to expect to compete for national championships every year. So the best case scenario for Clemson, obviously, is to win a national championship. I think you can say that pretty much every year. I don't think, in the last 5 or 6 years, there has not been a year where you didn't think Clemson at least had a chance to win a national championship. But we're going to look at how they could potentially get there. What is going to happen for this team to reach their best case scenario, which, again, would be a national championship. All right, so we're going to start with the quarterback, DJ Uiagalelei. He's going to have to stay healthy. That's going to be the biggest key, I think, for Clemson this year because we know what kind of talent he is. We've already seen him play last year. We've seen him play in a big game against Notre Dame on the road. Played really well in that game. I have no real concerns about him as the starting quarterback for Clemson. I think he is going to do great things. He'll be an all-ACC player, maybe even a Heisman contender. But if he goes down, you don't have a whole lot behind him. You don't really have any experience. You don't have that next 5-star guy or anything like that. They'll be okay at quarterback, but they're not going to be able to reach their best case scenario. They're not going to be able to win a national championship, in my opinion, without DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback. So that is going to be, in my opinion, the biggest key for Clemson in 2001. He has got to stay healthy. Next, the offensive line improves. That would be the next best case scenario for this Clemson team. Offensive line was, not great last year. I think we saw them maybe not be as good as we expected them to be. And then you look ahead to 2021, you're going to lose 2 of your top players on that offensive line, in Jackson Carman and then Cade Stewart there at center. So those are big concerns. Those are big concerns for Clemson. And it's a key for really any team. To win a national championship, you've got to be good on the offensive line. You're going to have some newcomers coming in there that maybe can help them out. We'll see how that works out. But again, if they're going to reach their full potential, if you're going to get to that best case scenario, I think you need the offensive line to improve a little bit in 2021. Number 3, how about the young running backs for Clemson? Will the young running backs boost this run game? A run game that was not as good last year, and a lot of that does go back to the offensive line. Obviously, Travis Etienne didn't just get worse going into last year. So these kind of go together. The offensive line needs to improve, and also, are you going to get that boost from these young running backs? Because when you look at the running backs for Clemson, they've got good guys. They've got good players. They don't have, Lynn J. Dixon, I think, is a very solid running back, but he's not a superstar. He's not going to go out and win a Heisman Trophy. You've got Michael Dukes, you got Chez Malusi, you got guys at running back that are capable, and they're going to give you a good solid run game. But for them to get to that next level, I think some of these young guys are going to need to step up. And first of all, we talk about Will Shipley, of course, number 1 all-purpose back in the country coming in this year. He's a 5-star guy. He's there for spring, so I think there's an opportunity for him to play a lot. And who knows, maybe even start for Clemson at some point this season. He probably won't start the season as a starter, but maybe he takes over later in the year. And then they've also got Phil Maffa, another talented running back. He was the number 8 running back in the country, a 4-star guy. So if these 2 guys can help out, give them a boost in the run game, that's going to go a long way toward, running back position is also an area where you usually have some injuries, so you need to have depth there. Obviously, best case scenario is you don't have any injuries. And, we talked about DJ there. Best case is you have no injuries, but I think losing him just means a little bit more than if you were to lose a running back. So, you want to stay healthy there. You want to get a boost from these young guys. And, a lot of it is not necessarily their running ability, their skill as a running back. It's more pass protection and things like that. So we'll see how that works out, see if the young guys can get in there and play a lot and give them a boost in the run game. And I think if they do, if they add that depth, if they improve offensive line and improve the run game, that is going to be really big for Clemson in 2021. And then we have the final one here. It's the defensive line. Best case scenario, the defensive line dominates for Clemson. I think this is the best unit on this defense, maybe the best unit on this team. I know they're loaded at wide receiver, and that's another thing when we talk about the offense. Best case is you want to keep these wide receivers healthy as well. They've had some issues there, but they're deep and they're talented. And I think, unless you just lose a bunch, 2 or 3 of them, you're going to be fine at wide receiver. That's why I didn't really mention that. They are going to be deep. They're going to be talented at wide receiver. But defensive line, I think, is the strength of this defense. And you look at all that they have coming back. Miles Murphy might be the best defensive end on this team. I mean, it's hard to even say. They are so good. You've got Justin Maskell. You've got KJ Henry. You've got Xavier Thomas. You got Tyler Davis. You got Brian Brzee. Maybe he's the best defensive lineman on this team. He was a big-time recruit and had a good year as a freshman. You got Trey Williams coming back. This is probably the deepest, most talented defensive line group in the country, I would say. And, it's a big reason why they won a national championship a couple years ago. It was that defensive line. And maybe they're not as talented at linebacker as they have been in the past. Maybe they're not as athletic at linebacker. Maybe you're not going to be quite as good in the secondary as they have been in the past. Losing Darian Kendrick, I think, is going to be big there. But the defensive line can really take care of a lot of the issues on the defense. If they are constantly getting pressure on the quarterback, if they are constantly stuffing that run game, it takes a lot of the pressure off of the linebackers, off of the defensive backs. And if that defensive line can dominate in 2021, which I think they can, then that's going to bode really well for this Clemson defense and maybe make the difference in them winning a national championship. So health, of course, with DJ is big, but really across the board, obviously every team wants to stay healthy. That's going to get you to the best case scenario. But you look at the schedule here. They were 10-2 last year. Of course, one of those losses coming in the playoff. But you look at the schedule and you start to go down the list and say, best case scenario, if everything goes well for us, who's going to beat Clemson? I'm not really seeing anyone. I think the only game that really could be competitive is that Georgia game. And I don't know if Clemson reaches their best case scenario, if all the things I just mentioned, they all happen, I don't know if Georgia even can beat Clemson, because this Clemson team, I'm telling you, is absolutely loaded. I'm going to say the best case is clearly 12-0. It's not even going to be hard to do. I mean, they should be able to beat everyone on this schedule easily. And then except for Georgia. So Georgia is really the season for Clemson. But again, if you get all of these things to happen for them, the best case scenario, they go 12-0. They win the ACC championship, which is going to be a tough game. Whether they play, maybe North Carolina or Miami, that's going to be a tough game. But they should be able to win that if, again, everything goes their way. They get to their best case scenario. And I think this team can absolutely win a national championship this year. In fact, if I had to pick right now, and I'm not going to make official predictions until much later in the offseason, a lot of things still to happen. We want to see what happens in the spring. Transfers still going on, and just doing more research on all these teams. But if I had to pick a national champion right now, I think I would probably go with Clemson, just because of how much production they have coming back on defense, because they've got an experienced quarterback. I know he hasn't played a full season, but he's played in big games, and they've got talent all around him. One of the best wide receiver groups in the country if they can stay healthy. The offensive line, again, is going to be a question. But if it all comes together for Clemson, this team 100% absolutely can win a national championship in 2021. Clemson has been in the college football playoff discussion really every year since we've had the college football playoff, or at least the last several years. And so it's hard to imagine them not being in that playoff discussion once again in 2021. But we're going to look at the worst case scenario, what could potentially happen to Clemson that's going to make them struggle and have the worst year that they possibly could have. And then I'll tell you what I think that is. All right, so we're going to start with the quarterback here, DJ Uiagalelei. It is so important that he stays healthy, because they don't have a lot of depth, don't really have any experience behind him. If he were to go down, and I think he's the only guy that they cannot lose. I mean, you look at every other position for Clemson, there's talent, there's depth. I'm not really concerned about one guy. If you lose your top 2 offensive linemen, obviously that's going to be a big deal. But if we're talking about one player, DJ Uiagalelei, he is the guy that has to stay healthy. If they're going to have a great year, he will have to stay healthy. But let's say he gets hurt, then all of a sudden you're talking about the worst case scenario for Clemson, and I think that's number one. You cannot have him get injured, so they need to protect him. Also, can they fill the holes on the offensive line? So let's say they can't fill the holes on the offensive line. That again would be another part of the worst case scenario for Clemson. They lose a couple of guys. You lose Jackson Carman, you lose Cade Stewart. They're going to look to some youngsters to step in there on the offensive line. But what if they don't? What if they're not ready? You know, you talk about a guy like Tristan Lay, expected to be a great player in the future, but will he be ready as a true freshman? That's going to be a question. Then we're also talking about that center position. That is a very important position on the offensive line. So filling those holes on the offensive line, getting production from the newcomers on the offensive line, going to be very important. But if they can't do that, I think the offense overall will struggle. And speaking of the offense, I think you also look at the worst case scenario here with no balance on offense. I think the passing game is going to be there for Clemson. I'm not too concerned about it with all these receivers coming back, and DJ, an experienced guy now. Again, if he stays healthy, the passing game should be fine. But what if they can't run the football? What if they can't find that balance? You know, DJ's not a guy that's going to give you a lot in the run game, less than Trevor Lawrence. So if they get one-dimensional and they have to throw, I think that's really going to be bad news for Clemson. You kind of saw that a little bit against Notre Dame last year in the first meeting. They've got to stay balanced on offense. You cannot be one-dimensional and have a great year. So we're going to say that worst case scenario is they don't really find a run game. They don't really have balance on offense. And overall, with that offensive line struggling as well, you see this Clemson team struggle in 2021. So that's worst case scenario on offense. What about the defense? I think the defense it's simply about the secondary. If the secondary struggles, this team is going to struggle overall. This defense is going to struggle. We saw it against Ohio State. Obviously, they did not play great in that game. And you lose Darian Kendrick. You know, that's a big loss. He transferred out of there. They've got guys. I mean, they've got talent coming back. But is there enough depth in the secondary to where you can say for sure that Clemson's going to be really good in the secondary? That's a question mark for me. You know, Andrew Booth, I think, is right there on the verge of being a great player. I think, you know, he has a chance to be an All-American type player. You've got him. You've got Mario Goodrich back. You got Sheridan Jones. You know, talented players. But again, depth might be a bit of an issue for them. Nolan Turner back at safety. That's big for them. Landon Zanders, he played pretty well for them last year. So again, you look at the starters, they should be pretty good. But what if you have some injuries in the secondary? What if the depth's not there? Again, if that secondary struggles, as good as the defensive line should be, you know, if the defensive line doesn't dominate and the secondary struggles a little bit, I think the Clemson defense overall struggles, and that is going to be a big problem for them. So they need that secondary to really step up and not get them to this worst case scenario. So what is the worst case scenario for Clemson? Last year they were 10-2. They lost 2 games and had a chance. You know, a lot of people thought they were going to win the national championship last year. They were in the playoff, but didn't make it. So you look ahead to 2021, and again, what is the worst case scenario for this team? Well, when you look at the schedule, you know, you've got several games. Even if all these things happen, if DJ gets hurt, if they can't run the football, the offensive line struggles, secondary struggles, this team is still too talented to lose to almost anyone on their schedule. Now, Georgia, obviously, they're not going to beat Georgia. If they get the worst case scenario, like we talked about, they're not going to beat Georgia. And then you got some other games here that could be tricky. NC State on the road, Boston College, who played them tough last year, Pittsburgh, Louisville on the road. These are games that could be a bit of a challenge. You know, I didn't include Florida State in here because it's at home, but Florida State could be a different team this year with a lot of transfers coming in. But what's your worst case scenario? Obviously, Georgia would be a loss in the worst case scenario. I think other than that, maybe you get upset somewhere because upsets do happen. And I'm just going to randomly pick a team and then pick NC State. But to me, worst case scenario really is 10-2 for Clemson. And that is, again, if DJ Uiagalelei gets hurt, if they can't run the football, if the offensive line struggles and the secondary struggles, if everything goes against them, I still think their worst case scenario is 10 wins. I mean, that's as bad as it's going to get for Clemson because of how good this team is. Now, I really don't see them losing to NC State, to be honest. I really could even say the worst case is 11-2. But the ACC championship could be a loss for them. So I would say a more realistic worst case scenario would be 11-1, and then losing in the ACC championship to not make it into the college football playoff. That's probably a more realistic worst case scenario. And that's, and that's not saying that everything's going to go against them, but things kind of go against them a little bit. You don't have to have all four of the things that I mentioned, but maybe they can't run the football, the offensive line struggles, something like that. They could lose to Miami or North Carolina in the ACC championship. So to me, just looking at the worst case, if things go as we expect them to go, worst case really is a second loss in the ACC championship. It would really take a disastrous season for Clemson to lose 2 regular season games, and that's saying a lot. I mean, imagine having your worst case scenario. Imagine having everything go against you, and you still finish with 10 wins. So that's how good Clemson, I think, can be and will be in 2021. And it's also just the schedule. It's also just showing you how easy this schedule is. NC State could be a pretty good team. Pitt could be a decent team. Florida State could be decent. Boston College could be a top 25 team. There are games on the schedule, and that's again why I say you could slip up, you could get upset somewhere. But Clemson is going to be an overwhelming favorite, I think, in every game that they play except for Georgia. So worst case for them is 1 or 2 losses. And I would honestly be surprised if they lost 2 games in the regular season. I would be very surprised. So worst case again for Clemson, 10-2 in 2021. Do you think they could do even worse than that? Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? Give me your thoughts down in the comments below.